All right, so I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to be as infotaining as possible. There are many representatives from SIG Cluster Lifecycle up here. We are a very large SIG with many sub-projects underneath it, and we'll go into more detail about some of the sub-projects that have sort of amalgamated underneath SIG Cluster Lifecycle a little bit later. So today we're going to talk about a basic overview of what is SIG Cluster Lifecycle. I know there's a lot of new contributors here too. So if you're interested and want to get involved and you care a lot about how clusters are stood up, configured, managed over time, then this is the SIG for you, right? We'll also talk about what happened in 2018, what's coming up in 2019, and where you can go to find more information. So what's our purpose? What is the purpose of SIG Cluster Lifecycle? It's not just to pass butter. So our objective is to simplify the creation and configuration, upgrade, and I'm putting quotes around downgrade, and Jordan's over there, and tear down of Kubernetes clusters and their components. So what is it that we actually do? There's many different sub-elements that sort of derive the whole complete view of what SIG Cluster Lifecycle does. But to get a full grokking of all of the details, we have created a charter for 2018, and all of the SIG was involved, all the major sub-project leads were involved in creation of that charter. So I highly recommend going and reading the charter in detail to understand what exactly we work on and how it sort of breaks down across the different sub-projects. So concretely, we basically create a series of different components. One of the things we've been striving to do, especially in recent years, is making a composable model, right? In the very beginning and early stages of the projects, there were a lot of different competing installers that all kind of did the same thing over and over and over again. And that was actually antithetical towards the long-term objective of sustainability, right? So a person would fix an issue in one component, but then have to percolate those fixes in all the other components. So now we've been focusing on sort of having this layered tier model. So at the base layer for deploying your control plane, there's kubeadm. For configuring your components, we are working on a proposal, and Lucas will talk about it a little bit later about component config. For simplifying infrastructure deployment, there's Cluster API, and there's also other installers like Cops. For add-on management, Justin can talk about bundles. And etcd management, Justin can also talk about etcd ADM, and much, much more, right? So it sounds neat and interesting, right? It sounds really cool to think about composable layers of what you want to do, but in reality, it's really spaghetti, right? It's a ton of spaghetti. But we try to decompose the problems, and then you're constantly trying to reinvent the model, which is a good thing, right? Kubernetes is not a done project. Nothing in Kubernetes is done, right? And so you should always think about wanting to sort of, for better or for worse, think about doing something anew, right? And as you do something anew, you can think about how to break apart the problem domain into individual discrete components that can be layered and used as a toolbox, right? So why do you care? Because we want clusters to be pervasive, right? We want it to be simple. The idea or the moniker that occurred around 2016 that actually led to the formation of SIG Cluster Lifecycle is that clustering was hard, right? With the course of the work that we did since the very beginning of the formation of the SIG, as well as some of the objectives of the SIG, is to simplify that, to make it easier for other folks to consume and to use, and hopefully over time, it just becomes easier and easier and easier. This helps to sort of spread the love of Kubernetes far and wide, right? If a developer can just stand up a Kubernetes cluster on their local environment, and it's almost seamless from the development perspective all the way through to the actual deployment in production, that is highly advantageous and is a highly leveraged point inside of the community. So what happened in 2018? I'll talk a little bit about this, and then I'll hand off to everybody else. So in 2018, from the SIG perspective, we formalized the charter. One of the things that we focused on a lot, both in sub-projects and the SIG, is actually fixing the docs. So yes, I am shaming other SIGs on purpose here. We focused on the docs. It was really important to us because our end user consumers are the front-facing people who basically give feedback to the whole community. So it's important for us to have documentation that people can actually leverage and is consistent and tested. Several other projects have joined the SIG. We've basically accreted a lot of the other different projects, and we tried to sort of restructure our meetings so that way we had a venue and a clearinghouse for all the SIGs to actually have a conversation, to bring up new topics, ideas, think if we should meld in new sub-projects, and if we were going to form other ideas and sort of split things apart. So one of the things that happened recently was the Coop Spray project was shifted from what was the Kubernetes incubator into the Kubernetes SIGs org. And like I mentioned before, it's all about better cross-project communication, collaboration, and composability. Lucas.
Yeah, so, well, that's a good start. I'm Lucas, another co-chair of the SIG. And as you might have noticed in the last couple of weeks, KubeADM was declared GA. Woo! As the first built from the ground up deliverable from the SIG, which was a great milestone. The new things in this 1.13 release feature declarative configuration, like component config that I'll talk about a bit later. But basically being able to configure everything about your Kubernetes cluster in a config file, not using flags, which has severe limitations. Also, managing the kubelets in the cluster was an important thing to get done, also declaratively. But I'm not going to run through all of this. But you see there's a lot of things that have been going on the latest year, especially. So now that we have KubeADM GA, we want to unify the ecosystem, as Tim said here, in the sense that if you're building this full, with infrastructure, with Kubernetes, with add-ons, with everything, this full solution, you can use KubeADM now as a toolbox. You maybe want to use small parts of it or all of it, but still get from the state where you have infrastructure, whatever VMs, machines, to the state where you have Kubernetes. And that's what you want to use KubeADM for, with sane, reasonable defaults, as the security folks here said earlier. The default in security isn't that great in Kubernetes today, but in KubeADM instead, we're pioneering these secure defaults, and eventually we'll probably get them into core. But if you use KubeADM, you have a sane set of defaults that you can use and that are maintained across minor versions. So the goal now that KubeADM is GA is for as many tools as possible, as we'll see here as well, to adopt KubeADM or use it, consume it inside of your product. And yes, we want your feedback. Here and in the related blog post, we have a survey created to make us understand better how we can mature this thing even more.
Great. My name is Robert. I'm also one of the co-chairs for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. One of the things that we've done over the past year is we've sort of stepped back from KubeADM, which is really geared towards creating a great sort of getting started experience for people who already have existing infrastructure, and looking at how we can abstract away the cloud provider infrastructure. So one of the things that Brian pointed out in the overview this morning was we want to have consistent abstractions across underlying infrastructure, and he pointed to storage as sort of leading the way here. And in our SIG, what we're trying to do is figure out how we can abstract the rest of sort of your cluster infrastructure, so that interacting with the cluster can become more consistent across different providers. So last year at KubeCon Austin, Chris Nova, who's here in the audience, and I gave a talk sort of introducing the Cluster API. And the Cluster API is really describing how to create and upgrade and manage the machines of your cluster, so dealing with the virtual or physical machines of a cluster, and also things like network allocations across your cluster. Over the past year, we've done things like migrate from CRDs to aggregate API servers and then back to CRDs, which is a little bit humorous. So we spent a lot of time going back and forth, but CRDs have come a long way and are really sort of the right way, I think, to go forward. They allow us to do things like easily adopt existing clusters, have better integration into tooling that already exists. And the bulk of this slide is pointing out that the adoption here, we've split apart the providers into separate repositories in the same way that the main Kubernetes repo is doing. And that's allowed us to very quickly adopt support for many, many different underlying infrastructure providers. So during KubeCon China about a month ago, 2 new providers were very quickly turned up in sort of preparation for that conference, so people could give talks about support for Tencent and Baidu, which was great because those of us sort of in this hemisphere are mostly concentrating on the the big providers that are coming out of North America.
I'll add one more thing. So as we have made these layers, like first infrastructure, we have Kubernetes, and then the add-ons. As we're building these layers, we have KubeADM in the Kubernetes layer, and we've by default made it work really well with the Cluster API. So if you do add your machines via CRD and have a cloud-specific controller that makes that happen, you should or you could use KubeADM to actually bootstrap the things on the machine. So the only thing you basically have to do in the node startup script is KubeADM join. And that's it. So we're trying to make these tools for you to use to glue all the things together really easily.
Looks like it's me. Yes, so COPS, I think the big thing which we've been working on for, it feels like forever, but I guess it's only been about a year, is finally getting everyone onto etcd 3. That has been a long-term challenge, and I think we are certainly at the end of the beginning on that. And I think it reflects sort of the long-term goal of COPS, which is to sort of get off COPS Island. So sort of using all these other things that the SIG Cluster Lifecycle is producing. And one of those, which I guess we'll talk about more later, is etcd ADM and that project. So hopefully less tied into COPS, and the COPS basically consumes Cluster API and Kube ADM and all these other great things that we're producing. In general, we have done lots and lots of releases. I think one of the interesting things we've heard from user feedback is that users like the fact that the .0 of COPS is a production suitable release, even if that means that we are 6-ish months behind. We are working on getting a little bit closer on that. And yeah, once we finally get past etcd 3, we really will start on the bundle and add-ons for common upgrades, Cluster API, and adopting CRDs as well for generally COPS. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Antoine, one of the maintainers of Coop Spray. So this year there was like a lot of activity on Coop Spray, and recently we joined being more close to the cluster lifecycle. So we joined the Kubernetes SIG organization. And what does it mean? It means more collaboration. Like say, on technical decision, we will go to the SIG, ask questions about which path we should take. And as a concrete example, for the next release, we're going to be only use KubeADM, as we can say, as a building block to install cluster and manage them. So we're not using all the feature, but we start with set, static pod, etc., and we work more closely, I think, in the same way. We receive a lot of contribution around network plugin, so we have many contribution across different topics, and yeah, so that's mainly Coop Spray.
Hi, I'm Thomas Stromberg, one of the maintainers for MiniCube. So this year we were really focused on improving the fidelity and reliability of MiniCube. One of the best things that we did was we jumped on the Kube ADM train and we retired LocalCube, which greatly simplified the MiniCube code base. We also, on the theme of fidelity, we added load balancer emulation. You might need to go look at the latest release as of this morning to actually use it. So V31. Out. So we also made support for alternative container runtimes better, all sorts of nifty little things here, basically just trying to make it easier to maintain and provide a great way to simulate production workloads, learn about Kubernetes, and do local development and testing.
Another thing that was adopted to the SIG in 2018 and after KubeCon Europe was the KubeADM DIN cluster. So this was a project that was started by Mirantis, basically for standing up local environments. And for a long time, there's been this conversation of wanting to, I don't know if James is in the crowd and Ben's in the crowd, of wanting to rewrite many versions of sort of over-under clusters, or Docker and Docker style clusters in a Golang format. And one of the sub-projects that was created out of SIG testing was the Kind project. And in the future, and we'll talk about this later on too, is that this is a high priority item. I know that Brian talked early on about wanting to improve testing and testability and basically making the core of Kubernetes more solid over time. This is a key aspect of some of the efforts that we're going to put rally the community around in the coming year. So again, what's coming in 2019? As I mentioned earlier, as Brian mentioned earlier, is the idea of TechNet Baytown versus the new shiny, right? As developers, we always focus on the new shiny, right? Because it's always fun to develop those things. It is not so much fun to actually make what we have better and more solid, reproducible, right? It's not a fun thing to sort of pay down some technical debt for a project that was basically never designed to scale at this pace, right? We have a tremendous amount of infrastructure, which is unique, to trying to solve problems that only exist because of the size and scale of this project, right? What are some other things coming on in 2019? Add-on management.
Yes, so Google open sourced a specification for bundles, and I think we are currently open sourcing our proposal for how we should do add-ons via operators. Jeff Johnson and I are talking about that on Thursday. The hope here is that the same benefits that we get from KubeADM will apply to cluster add-ons, which are sort of the pieces like the CNI provider, for example, that are managed alongside your cluster. So once we do the base layer, that there will be homogeneity, if that's a word, at the upper layers in terms of those things as well.
And also, like, it's clear to note here that this is only for things required to operate Kubernetes, not my random app that I want to deploy automatically when starting a Kubernetes cluster. It's going to be very scoped at what's needed. And also, the most common use case is I upgrade my cluster. I now need this new CNI provider or this new CSI thing or the next metric server version, things like that. And also having some consistency between COPS, Coop Spray, MiniCube, KubeADM, all the tools that are in the ecosystem have a lightweight spec of how to do stuff with regards to things on top of Kubernetes.
And etcd, so this is, I think, this exemplifies sort of how the SIG is working well. COPS was working outside of COPS itself on a tool called etcd Manager, which is sort of our orchestration layer for etcd, particularly for Kubernetes. So in other words, we don't want to rely on a Kubernetes API being available. So that's what's different from the etcd operator. But then we saw a project from Platform 9 called etcd ADM, which was sort of a CLI management layer for etcd. Similar sort of goals, etcd ADM being more manual and CLI driven, etcd Manager, the COPS one, being more automated. And we combined them under the SIG Cluster Lifecycle umbrella. We decided etcd ADM was a better name, so we took that. We did a KEP for it. Everything basically is going great, and we are hoping to actually get that properly going immediately after KubeCon and everything, the dust settles a little bit.
Yeah, and then we know that with all these pieces, with KubeADM, with the add-ons, with Cluster API, how do we actually manage these things? Well, we do it as any other Kubernetes API object via YAML. That's good and both good and bad, but it's at least better than using flags for configuring things. So the way we want to go here is move from using flags for configuring the core components and, for example, the add-ons as well, like kubeproxy and core DNS and stuff should support this way of declarative config. And then we also have loads of architectural, like code structural problems inside of the core. So basically all the components implement the same kind of features in a slightly different way, duplicating a lot of code. So with this new case.io component repo, or whatever it's going to be named, but something similar, we're working to extract what's needed to create some kind of Kubernetes-like component that has the same look and feel, for example, that reads structured and versioned configuration from disk and uses that for its own configuration, and then doing stuff like HTTP, like common HTTPS endpoints, delegated authorization and authentication. So to exec out to the API server and say, is this client allowed to access my interface? Things like that. And also, DIMS did great work with the Klog thing. Now we need to go one step further and also make the pflag and Cobra integration for our service more consistent. Yeah, and well, now with kubeadm GA, our config is we beta 1. We won beta 1. We don't expect any, like really any large changes to that, so we're just going to go ahead and bump that to V1 in the coming year. Then we have support. We have added support during the year for kubeadm join for -- control plane. So basically joining a node first, but also starting the API server and similar tasks needed for a control plane node. So doing all that kind of automation in one box is beneficial to do more of this unification. But also security, like there's this, as said earlier here, there's this discussion of security profiles. Can we integrate that in some way? Can we, the default security features we already have in kubeadm, can we merge them into default in core without having, like, introducing too many backwards incompatible changes? Well, everything component configuration. Right now we have this weird, in the kubeadm configuration, we have this weird string map that maps flags for the core components. If you want to override something, that's really not neat. So that's why we need the structured version configuration for the different control plane components, and incorporate the other etcd, Addon, and bundles projects when ready.
Not just related to kubeadm, but to all the sub-projects underneath SIG Cluster Lifecycle is better CI testing and release tooling. I think this has been mentioned several times, and I'll just keep on reiterating it. How many people in the audience have had to do retest? If all your hands up and if you contributed to the Kubernetes project, your hand should be up. Now, how many of you know that a lot of these tests that are flaking actually have nothing to do with test flakes at all? Right? Very few, right? Well, there's a couple people in the back, right? Some of them have to do with how we are actually executing against providers, right? So poor Justin gets blamed a lot for COPS failures, and most of the time, it has nothing to do with COPS at all. It has to do with the fact of how we have the test infra set up to execute against COPS. So what are we going to do to try and mitigate some of these problems that exist? We are going to throw down. We are going to have folks on the SIG actually integrating with the testing folks and fixing a lot of the core problems that exist. In part because we are inextricably linked between testing and release process. We are at that focal point. So whenever a version upgrade test fails, we are the first line of defense. We get called almost immediately, right? So one of the things we're going to do, we've talked with Ben as well as other folks about trying to get Kind as one of being hopefully in the future the only PR blocking job to do end-to-end tests, and move all of the other infrastructure provisioning jobs to be periodics, right? So you will get signal. It will be at a less granular scale, but it'll probably be far less flaky too as well. CI release artifacts. How many folks know that there's actually like split versioning, there's split brain between what's tested in CI and what's actually released, right? Only people on SIG Cluster Lifecycle and release know these things, right? So that is a really unfortunate situation, and it has nothing to do actually with a problem. It has mostly to do with legacy and ownership. So again, we are going to try to throw down this cycle and try to fix these problems because we have accreted so much technical debt, and as we have moved things to GA, we need to be able to sort of pay down that debt. So I want this to be a theme coming out from Brian as well as other SIGs, is that we are trying to pay down this debt. This is important to make sure that we have a solid functioning system that is sustainable and maintainable over time. And yeah, basically that's about it.
Great. For the Cluster API this year, we are planning on cutting our first alpha release quite soon. The API is almost there and very close to being sort of the first stable-ish version. We're going to wait to cut further releases until we have conversions built into CRDs. One of the reasons I mentioned earlier we moved away from CRDs is because there were a number of features that didn't exist in CRDs that were in aggregate APIs that are now showing up in CRDs. And we expect in the next release or two of Kubernetes to be able to have webhooks to do version conversion for the APIs, which will allow us to have an upgrade experience. Again, as Tim was saying, we wanted to spend a lot of time paying down debt and building test and release automation. And in particular, one of the goals here is in sort of parallel with moving to Kind for release blocking tests is to finally deprecate and remove the cluster directory from the core Kubernetes repository, which is something it's been there for a long time, and we've long had plans to get rid of it, and that's really on the roadmap for 2019 as we're starting to gain steam on some of these efforts. Like with kubeadm, deploying HA is something that we're starting to design and sort of in concert with the kubeadm folks, as many of the providers delegate to kubeadm as they're creating the control plane for their cluster. I already mentioned the next one, autoscaler integration. This is something that's sort of been one of the promised features of the Cluster API is when you have a generic way to manage your cluster infrastructure, you start to get things for free like cluster autoscaling, maybe node auto provisioning across different infrastructure providers. We've been having a lot of conversations with SIG autoscaling, and we expect in 2019 those discussions to come to fruition as to actually have an autoscaler implementation that targets a Cluster API that we can use across multiple providers. Right now, the bootstrapping process uses MiniCube, which is proved to not be great in a number of different scenarios. And we have a number of people that are investigating alternatives to MiniCube for the places where it doesn't work. I think it's a great developer getting started experience, but not as good if you're trying to run like in an enterprise environment where you may not be able to actually run a virtual machine. And then we're going to keep investigating new providers. There are a number of people that are interested in using bare metal instead of cloud infrastructure. It's not clear exactly what that's going to look like because a lot of bare metal installations look very different. But the people that are working on that, we can at least provide them a home to come together and sort of share common implementation where possible.
Hey. So try to be short on Coop Spray. We integrate with the CI to get a signal when kubeadm there is a new release or just a merge and master. We need to know if Coop Spray is still working, and so we loop to this signal so we know if there's an issue. Integrate with Cluster API, and one of the feedback is performance to deploy at scale on hundreds of nodes. So we're going to work on that and integrate with etcd ADM also as soon as it's available. We continue to work also to integrate with, we support Cryo as container engine, Docker, and we continue to work on adding more options. This is part of the project to be composable, so everyone can choose what's the component behind the scene and working with cluster bundle. So basically integrate everything from cluster lifecycle into Coop Spray projects and continue to work on that.
So if folks want to get involved, I usually ask folks join the mailing list or the standard SIG Cluster Lifecycle channel. There are so many sub-projects, we can use that for routing. There are different channels for all the different sub-projects. So and even individual providers for given sub-elements of a sub-project, right? So because of that, probably go to the main sub-project channel and just ask a question or send a mail to the mailing list. And there's also more conversations going on today as well as this week If you want to know more, there's a BOF this afternoon, and we're going to talk a lot about the roadmap items that we've been currently discussing right now, as well as there's other talks this week, both SIG-related and just broader in scope, pertaining to SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Last but not least, shoutouts. This SIG is a very, very large SIG. I've been in awe by the amount of people and contributions and effort that has gone into it. One person I don't actually have on this list, which I should have on this list, is Dims. He's done a ton of work, and so just give us a hand to Dims. There's been a ton of folks involved in all of this to get things out the door, to get them on time, to get them tested and vetted. This really is a community-wide effort, and I'm always in awe by all of the effort that folks put into this. And yeah, many thanks.
Yeah. One last thing. I forgot to mention we're also starting a new working group for this component refactoring thing. So we haven't even decided on a name, but myself, Mike Torfen, and Stefan Szymanski. Yeah, there, both of you are going to start this after KubeCon and at the beginning of next year.
Just one more thing to wrap up. I hope you can see from all the various people here and all the sub-projects I was mentioning that we are starting to see some alignment across the SIG as we've been pulling people together across these different layers. And so I think when we talked last year as a SIG about the different layers of Kubernetes, it was much more sort of theoretical and it was much more spaghetti code. And throughout the year, we've been slowly starting to sort of realign each of the sub-projects on some common horizontal infrastructure, which I think is going to sort of pay great dividends in the future, both for development velocity across the projects, but also for our users where they're going to have a much more common interaction model with clusters as they create them and manage their lifecycle going forward.
Awesome. All right, thanks, SIG Cluster Lifecycle. I've got some announcements real quick.
Sorry, I'll just do it.